Hey folks, my name is Jen, and today we're going to talk about a certain collection of books of mine. Yeah. So today we have a slightly different background because I am going to be talking about a selection of books that are currently housed in my living room. So you can see we have a little banks here. Also, it is really hot in this house and the breeze coming through is wonderful, so that's why we're here too. The bunch of books that I want to talk about today are my collection of books about Vermont. So while I do live in Massachusetts, I grew up in Vermont. I spent like the first 22 years of my life there, and as such, I really enjoy reading about it, just because I kind of miss it. So I really like reading fictional books that are about there, and then I also really enjoy reading non-fiction books about there, because I find it fascinating. And also, my classes talked a little bit about Vermont history growing up. We didn't really spend a ton of time focusing on Vermont specific history. Most of our history was just your usual US history and everything, so I really like reading about the history of the state now as an adult, and learning different things and hearing about different people and stuff like that. Besides my usual collection of books that basically go from genres, the usual like fantasy, sci-fi, classics, mysteries, etc. and everything, I also have a specific collection of books that I keep together which focus on Vermont, or they're fictional books that are set in Vermont. Just go over my collection of those books. Basically, you've probably seen, if not all of them, you've seen some of them before because I've talked about them in previous videos, and I will be talking about a couple of them in future videos, so yeah, let's get into everything. So first up we have some non-fiction. I've got a couple of books here that are based on research, or they're not based on research. I'm using them for research purposes. So I have been working on, I'm working on a couple of different writing projects, but one of them is set in Vermont in the past. So even though the book isn't that far past, I have a lot of ground to cover, and I want to understand more of that time period, but also like what came before, so I could have a better understanding of what influences, well, now just because it's interesting, but also that time period that I'm going to be working in. So yeah, basically just doing a lot of extra research that maybe I don't have to do, but just makes me feel better to be doing it. Yeah. Anyway, a couple of the books that I have for that. First up is the one that I have read, which is Wicked Vermont. This is by Thea Lewis, and it is the darker side of the Green Mountain State. And this, as you can see, annotated, marking it up for my research purposes, and this covers like darker aspects of Vermont, because I think most of the time, unless you live in Vermont, or maybe like live right next to it, most people, I think, when you mention Vermont, they probably think, you know, maple syrup, cows, Ben and Jerry's. You might think the Green Mountain Boys, if you know anything about history, like Ethan Allen, everything, who by the way was a major dickhead, but that's another story. Yeah, so you might think about stuff like that. If you know a little bit more about Vermont history, you might know a little bit about the founding of various schools there, or Champ, the Lake Champlain monster, or Maybe you might know more about like the spiritualism and stuff, like random weird stuff that happened, went on up in Vermont at one point too. This basically goes into darker, slightly lesser known things. This talks about like prohibition a little bit of controversy about whether or not one of the US presidents was actually Canadian or was born in Vermont, and stuff like that. There's also a little bit about the Witch of Wall Street, Hetty, let me see, I think it's Hetty Green. It's been a while since I read this book. Yeah, Hetty Green. And then also, there's also an H.H. Holmes connection. He's the Devil in the White City. If you know anything about that, one of the most prolific, potentially, serial killers. Really more darker stuff that you don't see in like tourism pamphlets and things like that. And it's pretty interesting. I enjoyed this book, but I didn't enjoy it as much as some of my other books, just because I didn't really like the tone that the author took in here. I found her kind of annoying, but useful anyway. Another book for research that I'm still currently reading is Hidden History of Vermont, and this is by Mark Bushnell. And it's also boasts to be the unseen side of the Green Mountain State. For very interesting things I've heard before and other things I have not heard about before. There's a story about zoological discoveries, killing all of the wolves throughout Vermont. There's this story about marching turkeys to market, which is really interesting. Basically, it was like taking these turkeys and marching them for miles to be able to like sell them. Bits about whether or not catamounts are still in Vermont. The last one was killed in 1881. So like just interesting zoological things. I just finished a chapter on Ethan Allen, which I can't stand him. But yeah, just a lot of interesting things throughout here. A lot of random spiritualism and psychic stuff that I had never heard of before growing up. But I've been hearing stories in here, and in a couple of the other books I've read, which is interesting because some of them tie back to fictional books that I've read about Vermont too, so that's pretty cool. But yeah, this is just interesting. It's I like books like this because it's nice. It's something a little bit different than just your standard like text, like a thick textbook that's really boring about particular states. So yeah. And then this one is my research book that I haven't read yet, because I think this one might be a little slightly less interesting perhaps, but you never know, it might turn out to be pretty cool. It's Roadside History of Vermont, and this is by Peter S. Jennison. I guess this is part of the Roadside History series. Looks like maybe there's more states in this series perhaps. It has some of the same stories, like stuff about Catamount to Champ to varying things like that, plus a lot of like very interesting history throughout the state. And it looks like it goes from, if not town to town, it at least goes from like region to region, which is pretty cool. I'm fairly excited to see what's in here written about the county that I grew up in. So yeah, just looks pretty cool, but I'm sure I'll have more to say about this whenever I get around to eventually reading it. These have been slow to get through because, like I said, I'm using them for research, so I've been like slowly annotating them and writing notes down and like notating things I need to know for my story, or maybe interesting facts that I'm like, dude, I want to stick that in there somewhere, you know, or coming up with different ideas. So, as for my other books, I have another stack of nonfiction right here. First of all, this one, I actually think my folks gave me this. Yeah. Oh yeah, because I have the card they gave me with it. It's a coffee table book. I think they gave me this when my husband and I got our first like apartment together. And it's Vermont Icons, 50 Classic Symbols of the Green Mountain State by Jennifer Smith Mayo and Matthew P. Mayo. And it is just like a little coffee table book going through various icons of the state. So we've got Vermonters, dairy farms, town commons, Woodstock, which I went trick-or-treating there a couple of times. Big candy, because the rich people live there. You get the king-size candy bars. Fall foliage, general stores, those are always like super great, and just stuff like that. So it's got like lots of pretty pictures and then like a little bit of information about everything. So yeah, it's just your typical coffee table book, but it's really cool. Then we've got some other books. So this one is Off the Leash, Subversive Journeys Around Vermont, and this is by Helen Husher. And yeah, it's like kind of along the lines of these lesser known historical facts or just weird things about Vermont. This is like more interesting places. So it's not just like visiting Vermont and going to Burlington or seeing Montpelier or checking out the cider mills or Ben & Jerry's or whatever, you know. It's not Shelburne Farms, maybe, even though I love that area, but this is more odd things to do around Vermont. So there's the grave of Justin Morgan, who is like the guy who made the Morgan horses. Then you've got Champ, so again, Lake Champlain monster. There's some sea caves. There's this labyrinth. There's the Bread and Puppet Museum, which I've never been, but sounds kind of creepy. And yeah, there's just very interesting, more like it says subversive journeys, so more interesting things to take your look at if you're making a trip up there that aren't like the typical everyday tourist spot, basically, if you're looking for something a little bit different. And yeah, this was just a random book that I picked up a few years ago because I was feeling homesick and I saw it and thought it sounded cool, and then had the fun thing of looking in here and finding that my town that I grew up in was written about in here randomly. So that was pretty cool. Other things that I've got, I have these two books that I read fairly recently, and what's funny about this is these two authors were friends. So first is Contrary Country, A Chronicle of Vermont, and this is by Ralph Nading Hill. That is the dude. And this is along those lines of interesting facts about history. So this like talks about people who founded different schools, stuff about Calvin Coolidge, who was one of the presidents born in Vermont, stuff about steamboats from like Lake Champlain and stuff, different interesting facts and chronicling historical events, both quirky and cool, and then also talking about just Vermonters in general and how interesting Vermonters are. It says, Vermonters are chemically unable to endorse the popular view. Which that's, I don't know, I both agree and disagree with that. I don't know, it's just kind of funny. So that is that book. And then this book is Successful Calamity, A Writer's Follies on a Vermont Farm by Edmund Fuller. And this is a guy, he and his family lived in, I believe they're in New York. He's in like publishing and stuff like that. and they decide that they want to go somewhere more rural. They want to get away from everything. He had like a health scare, and they just want to kind of get away. So they end up buying a farm, sight unseen, in Vermont, in like, and then like moving there. And this is about the years that they lived on this farm in Vermont. And the struggles and the quirky people and farm life, and just trying to figure their shit out, basically. This is an overhead view of the farm area. I don't actually know if the farm still exists anymore, but it was right up near the lake, basically. A really cool book. This is, I think, might be my favorite nonfiction book about Vermont so far. There were a couple of parts that were a little bit upsetting because it is about farm life, so, you know, if you're, like, not into hearing about animals getting killed for eating and stuff like that, just be forewarned, there's some stuff like that in there. So, yeah, but otherwise, just very, very cool read. They moved there in, like, the, late 40s, early 50s, so it's also in that specific time period too, which is cool because I also have fictional books that are about Vermont in that time period. So yeah, I haven't read this yet, but I'm looking forward to reading it soon. I was originally going to read it in the summer, but I have so many things that I'm already planning to read this summer, so I don't know, this might end up being more fall or winter. This is Anything Can Happen in Vermont, and it's by Marguerite Hurry Wolf. This is about the author and her family. Her husband was the dean of the College of Medicine at UVM, so the University of Vermont, and they ended up moving from, I believe, either New York or New Jersey. They ended up moving to Vermont and living there for several years. So this is basically her experience writing about living in Vermont, and how sometimes very interesting and eccentric your neighbors can be, and stuff like that. And I always like reading about that kind of thing. I don't mind like a fish out of water story, and I am kind of a sucker for someone moving from a very different environment and going somewhere new, especially if it's rural. Even though sometimes I don't always like how like movies portray Vermont. Sometimes it rubs me the wrong way, but books are kind of a different story. Books are a little more nuanced, I guess. It's not like so much stereotypes, it's just more interesting overall. But yeah, I think this will be a fun little read. And then I've got these books, which are also nonfiction, but it's more like spooky or weird stuff. So the first one is Mischief in the Mountains, which is Strange Tales of Vermont and Vermonters. And I'm not really sure on like an actual author, but this was published by Vermont Life magazine, which I don't know if Vermont Life still exists anymore. I haven't seen a copy in like forever, so I don't know. And this also has like, oh, that's why, because it's writing by different authors. Yeah, so one of these stories in here is by Ralph Nightingale, who wrote the Chronicle of Vermont. And just very interesting things. So you've got like stuff about the Vermont vampire scare, very like ghost stories, and this really weird urban, it's still an urban legend if it's in a rural community. I don't know. The Frozen Folk, which I actually have heard people talk about on a podcast before, which is really cool, which is like this old rumor based on a story that someone wrote, which is definitely fictional, about hard winters in Vermont and people taking their sick people and their elderly and basically making them almost dead. Like they're still alive, but they've been slowly like frozen, and then they get like, yeah, basically frozen and kept safe for the winter so they can survive, and also it doesn't deplete more of the food because more of the food can go with the healthy family members, and then in the springtime the long process of thawing these people out and bringing them back to life, basically. Weird ass gothic shit, which is 100% not true, but it was like a story that somebody wrote and then became like this whole rumor, and people like actually believed that this is what people in Vermont were doing. It's really weird. Yeah, just strange stories like that is what's in here. And then this one is a little more newer than that, and it's Green Mountain Ghost Schools and Unsolved Mysteries by Joseph A. Citro. And I believe he's got like, I think he's written more than one book about like Vermont and about like different states and stuff like that. But it has some of the same kind of idea, like weird stories like that, or it has like ghost stories and haunted places and vampire stories and aliens and just really interesting things like that too. This can be a little bit dry sometimes. This is from like the 70s, so the writing's a little bit different. So this is just a slightly more exciting, but overall just really cool of my nonfiction stuff. Then, so what I've got for fictional books is I have this classic, which is Understood Betsy by Dorothy Canfield, or people might know her better as Dorothy Canfield Fisher. There's an award named after her. And this is similar enough to Anne of Green Gables, I guess, where it's a young girl who, for reasons, although these reasons are different, but she's a young orphan girl who has been raised by her aunts and stuff in the city, and because she herself is a little anxious and a little sickly, although most of it seems to be like related to her anxiety and like hypochondria and stuff like that. Her family is also sick, so she is sent to live with her uncle and aunt. I think that might be like her great uncle and aunt, maybe. But they live on a big old farm in Vermont, and she's sent to live with them for a while everybody else gets well. And this is just about her finding just a wonderful family and coming into her own and growing as a person and really getting to a place where she is no longer this like incredibly anxious and worried kid, to a place where she's like learning more about herself, learning more about life, learning how to be more independent. And it's not that her family that she was being raised by was like neglectful or mean or anything, but it's just like the way that they treated her differs a lot from just the very warm and kind and like, I don't know, her family in Vermont. It's just, oh, it's so great, you guys. This was like one of my top books from, this is my top book from last year. I adore this book. It is beautiful. It made me cry. It's such a good tale. If you are like me and like the whole little girl gets sent to live in the country with some family kind of stories, like, you know, Secret Garden and Anne of Green Gables and stuff like that, if you're like me and you love that shit, you will probably like this. It's so beautiful. I've got a couple of series which I'm sure people know about because these authors are fairly popular. The first of which is the Truly Devious series, or the Stevie Bell series by Maureen Johnson, which starts out with Truly Devious, and this is following a girl named Stevie Bell who she manages to get into this really like prestigious school called the Ellingham Academy up in Vermont, and this is a special school that was founded by this like rich tycoon, and it specializes in getting teenagers, I think they're basically supposed to be, if not freshmen, they're at least sophomore, junior, and seniors or something like that, and it basically, whatever your special interest is, you take classes and things, but you get to focus in on your specialized interest. So there's characters that are writing a book or making inventions or doing art pieces, musical pieces, different things like that. It basically takes kids with lots of high potential and helps them do more about their specialized interest. And part of the process of getting into this school is like outlining what your interest is, what your ultimate project is, what you want to go to the school for. And Stevie Bell writes in that she wants to go because she wants to solve the mystery of Ellingham Academy. Basically, a few years after the school itself was founded, the rich man who founded the school, unfortunately, his wife and daughter were kidnapped. Their disappearance is like one of the biggest unsolved crimes in history, and the only clue was this letter that was left behind signed by Truly Devious. So Stevie Bell is like a true crime obsessed and decides that she wants to go to this school because she's fascinated by the mystery, and she wants to ultimately become a detective someday, but she wants to solve this unsolved mystery of the school. There's more books now that are based in other places. I've read one of them, but this murder mystery trilogy focused on Ellingham Academy in Vermont is Truly Devious, The Vanishing Stair, and The Hand on the Wall, and this is a great series. I really enjoyed it, not only for how it captured Vermont in such a good way, but also it just scratched an itch that I didn't know I needed to be scratched. Wait, that doesn't sound right. Basically, it's like a girl who's true crime obsessed. She listens to true crime podcasts, but she also dealing with a lot of anxiety. She has a couple of really cool friends, and one of them is like a writer who wrote this great bestseller, and he's struggling to be able to write anything else. And it's like there's just lots of parts of this, including like the unsolved mystery aspect and the desire to know things, just all of it wrapped up into this beautiful package. I loved this trilogy a lot. It's just like it involves so many things that I love. So yeah, really fun YA mystery trilogy. And we've got the Small Spaces Quartet. This is by Catherine Arden. I know that you guys have heard me, if you've been around here a while, talk about Small Spaces, which is one of my favorite books of all time. This is a series, a middle grade horror series that starts with Ollie. Ollie had a terrible tragedy happen the year before. Her mother died in an accident, and her and her father have just been kind of going through the motions, but Ollie is really not handling grief very well. She stopped doing activities she loved. She's pushed a lot of people away, and she's just trying to cope. And one day she finds this book, which is called Small Spaces, and it's this really weird kind of ghost story almost, and she's kind of interested in the book. And then when her class goes on this field trip to this farm that's been redone and is like trying to like make a comeback, basically, while she's there, Ollie realizes that this farm is the farm that was in the book Small Spaces, and she thought that was a fictional book, but now it seems like it might actually be nonfiction, and there is now a horrifying figure who is out to get her class. So creepy. This something that I love about this series, it captures Vermont so well, from all of the seasons, the people, just the vibe and everything like that. It's just so beautifully done. It is legitimately creepy. Like, I know this is for middle grade, but there are parts of these books that horrified me. Like this, there's some creepy elements in here. Okay? This scared the ever-loving shit out of me. Alright, so, like I said, it follows the season. So Small Spaces is in the fall. Dead Voices is in the winter. There seems like there might be an homage to The Shining in here. Loved it. There's an aspect to this book that freaked me the fuck out. Then you have Dark Waters, which is in the summer, which is pretty good. But I wasn't that scared by it. Then you have Empty Smiles. Oh, no, I lied. Dark Waters is the spring. Empty Smiles is the summer. There's clowns. That was a lot. Good series. I will admit, if you've been here, you've heard me gripe about book 4. Like, I didn't like how the series ended, which, yeah, I still don't quite like how the series ended. But overall, it was a decent series, and if you're looking for an okay scare but nothing that's going to give you nightmares, I mean, this is perfect for that. And like I said, I think it captures Vermont very well. But for speaking about really capturing Vermont, then I have to talk about my Howard Frank Mosher books. So Howard Frank Mosher was a Vermont writer, and he passed away several years ago. But he just wrote so beautifully about Vermont. He's got a couple of, so these are my fictional books by him. He's also got a couple of nonfiction books, but the 2 nonfiction books that I have of his don't focus on Vermont. Then I think he did actually write a nonfiction book set in Vermont, but I don't own that, and I have not read it. But he did also write a lot of fiction books. So these are some of his fictional books. One that I have not finished reading is The Fall of the Year. And these are all set in like this fictional Kingdom County up near the Canadian border. And this one is about some of the eccentric inhabitants of Kingdom County, and deals a lot with like fortune tellers and a lot of like very quirky characters, and it's kind of about this young man who comes back home and is staying with like his adoptive father, I believe, and some of the interesting people that he deals with at this time. And yeah, I haven't finished reading that one yet because I'm not vibing with this story as much as I do with the rest of his books. But usually his books are just really beautifully written. Some of them, like I said, they're all based in Kingdom County. Some of them deal with some of the same characters, like on Kingdom Mountain. This is set in 1930, and it's following Miss Jane Hubble Kinnison. She is like a bookwoman, bird carver, and the last remaining resident of a wild mountain on the US-Canadian border, which is threatened by a proposed new highway. And she ends up meeting and becoming friendly with this stunt pilot who comes into town. And this is also dealing with lost gold that was stolen by some like Civil War deserters. Just really interesting story. Beautiful, beautiful lines in here. Speaking of more of the Kinnison family, these 2 books focus in on Jim Kinnison. So in this one's kind of like a coming of age story about Jim when he's a bit younger. I think he might be in like junior high at this time. This is A Stranger in the Kingdom. It was also made into a movie. It's got like mysterious elements in it. There's like a courtroom drama involved because this one focuses in on it's not only a coming of age for Jim just growing up in the town and dealing with all the quirky residents, but it's also what happens when a black preacher comes to town because their last pastor, I think, died or left, and so this new pastor has come in with his son, and it's the town basically reacting, and it deals with like racism and classism and prejudice and what evils can lurk in a small town even though people don't think, well, this couldn't happen here kind of thing. Is very I think, beautifully done. It does have some courtroom drama because a crime happens and the preacher is accused of the crime, and there's just a lot going on in this book, and it's so beautifully done. And then God's Kingdom is set much later. This is when Jim is like almost an adult, and this is also kind of along the same themes of racism, classism, evils lurking in a small town. This is Jim learning some secrets in the town, especially dealing with darker aspects that nobody wants to think about. And it's just also beautifully, beautifully done. And I actually think this is one of his, I think this might have been either Frank Mosher's last book or one of his last books. Then you'll hear me talk about more of these books later, because a couple of them are my favorite books of all time. So there's also a book, oh, I don't have it. It's still with my parents. It's called Disappearances, and it's very different from this. It's set in the 1920s, 30s, and it deals with Prohibition. And it's about this crazy journey that this young boy takes with his dad and a couple of others to try to go up to Canada to smuggle their rum running, basically. And it's this absolute batshit bonkers journey that they take to try to save their family that's basically destitute by rum running during the Prohibition. And it's just wacky bonkers. Then there's Northern Borders, which you can see I've begun to annotate. I love this book so much. This is dealing with a different family. This isn't the Kinnison family. This is the Kittredge family. And this follows another young boy, Austin. His mother dies, and his dad ends up sending him to live with his grandparents in Kingdom County on their farm. Because if he grows up there and goes to the local school, they have this kind of arrangement worked out with one of the colleges that then he'll get like basically a free ride to college. So this is the story of Austin, or Tut as his family calls him, as he lives with his grandparents from age 6 to about 18. And it is absolutely gorgeous. Again, just the quirky, eccentric characters, the beautiful setting, the way the seasons change, the stories, the people, the absolutely gorgeous fucking writing. This book makes me cry every single time I read it, and I really don't mind. It is so, so beautifully done. And if you are someone who had a very close relationship with your grandparents, you would potentially also love this book, because oh my gosh, I just love it so much. I do have one more book that I basically gave to my parents to read. It's Open Season by Archer Mayer, and it is the first in a detective series. It's set in Brattleboro, and I want to continue that series at some point, but I've only read book 1, and it was pretty good. So yeah, guys, that was basically that's my Vermont book collection. I'm always trying to collect a few more. I just really love collecting books set there because, like I said, I grew up there. I still have a soft place in my heart for Vermont and the people that live there, and I just really love it. And part of my love for it is also why I decided to set a couple of books there. I have one book that is a mystery that is set there, and then I have my current writing project, which is another mystery, which might end up being a series that is set there too, because growing up, I wanted more books that were set in Vermont, because that's where I was growing up, and I'd like to provide that for other people, is more cool books that they can read about their home state or whatever. This is my little collection. It might grow in the future. Thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you for always watching, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.